Hi, I'm Amber, and you are listening to the Caretaker Journey podcast.
Welcome to another meaningful conversation. I am your host, Carole Leathem, and I want to welcome you to a very, very special July 4th episode of the podcast. As we celebrate freedom and honor the brave men and women who have served our country, and today we are celebrating that July 4th, I want us to take a moment to recognize those unsung heroes behind the scenes. Our veterans, their caretakers, and as a caretaker, you carry a sacred calling. You're tending to a brave heart who once stood in the gap for our freedom. And now they're in need of tender strength and daily grace. And the Lord sees every one of you caretakers and every sacrifice that you make in love. And He promises to renew your strength as you serve your your veteran, with compassion and courage. Your care is a living reflection. It is holy ground. It is a sacred work of Christ's love, a quiet, steadfast light guarding our heroes through their healing. And I know so many veterans that need this healing. And today we honor you, the caretaker, and we honor the active military, and we honor our veterans. My special guest today is Amber J. Parker. And Amber is a physician's assistant. She's turned caregiver. She's a mental health advocate, a speaker, a writer, and she was the caregiver for her veteran husband when he was battling suicidal ideation and PTSD. She is the author of She is the author of The Forgotten Caregiver of Mental Crisis. And the subtitle, I love this, don't miss this, it's Navigating Suicidality After Trauma with Increased Hope, Resilience, and Practical Strategies. This book will be published later in the summer, and I'm going to have her come back once it's published, and we're going to talk in depth about it. And it comes out of her personal story, along with some neuroscience and some research that she's done. Amber is passionate about integrating neuroscience, and I love that because I love neuroscience, so I'm really excited about this. And faith in God, and then EMDR for PTSD and emotional healing. Amber desires for you to be empowered in your battle and to know, this is her one of her main taglines, you are not alone in your battle. So Amber, let me welcome you to the show.
Thank you. Yeah. And that tagline, you are not alone in your battle, because we feel weary and alone when we are caregiving.
So true. And it really crosses the boundaries of all caregiving. So your tagline could be something, your signature saying could be something that applies to everyone. So Amber, let's just start out and dive into your story. Will you share with us your story and how this kind of all started?
Certainly. Well, and I have actually been and am a caregiver for additional diagnoses beyond mental health as well. But for mental health purposes and how this book came to be, my husband was in the Air Force. He is retired now, and he's been deployed. And on his first deployment, there was an IED explosion that killed one of his buddies. And as a result of that event, and there's a lot more to it than just the death of his buddy and the IED explosion, but through that event, it obviously impacted him deeply. And he came home, and he actually shifted gears and purpose as a result of that deployment to pursue helicopter training with the military to become a combat search and rescue pilot. And so as we continued on our journey, you fast forward many years later, and he was deployed after that as a pilot, etc. But you fast forward many years later, and what happened in that first deployment began to attack him in his dreams and in his sleep. And so, horrible nightmares. He couldn't face sleep. And so he tried to deal with it on his own, and, thought he might be able to, so it wouldn't affect our family and our life. And so he began to treat it with alcohol, but then also, went to the doctor and got Ambien, a sleep medication, to try to help, because he needed to be able to face the night when the nightmares would come. And there was a God-ordained night where the Lord allowed me, orchestrated the moments, to allow me to become aware of what he was battling, because he was fighting on his own for around a year. And so anyhow, that God-ordained night, I found out, and I'm a PA, a medical provider, so in terms of what he told me, I recognized symptoms of PTSD. I knew he was dealing with that. I also knew he was taking, a medication that I was concerned by with the addiction potential, certainly. But then I knew that, and I say this in my book, it was a pivotal night. I knew that this was a marked moment of change. And that night I became a caregiver of mental health, of PTSD. And that night I asked a very important question, and a question that I want to encourage anyone to always ask, which is, have you had any thoughts of suicide? Are you having any thoughts of suicide or of harming yourself in any way? And that night he told me no, he didn't have any, and no, he had never. So, went to bed knowing we were dealing with PTSD, but not suicide. You fast forward a few months later, and finally he was able to tell me that actually he had been dealing with suicidal thoughts and fighting against suicidality, which is that word encompasses anything to do with suicide.
Yeah.
Thoughts, plan, attempt, all of it. And so anyway, that again shifted the course for us, and we went, it was about from when I first found out about his PTSD and that night, to when he was doing much better as a result of us finally getting him in to the treatment that he needed, which was EMDR, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. Finally, when we did that, it was a little over a year and a half, so almost 2 years of continual caregiving, day in, night out, and we had, suicide plan with a hospitalization. There was then a suicide attempt, and
I'm
praise
so
the Lord,
sorry.
the Lord allowed me to save him, and hospitalization, and then 2 more hospitalizations for increased suicidal thought without going further. So,
Yeah.
got it before we got to full-on emergency. And so anyhow, it was this up and down battle. It was chaotic. It was incredibly stressful. I had 2 little ones, 2 children that we were doing life with, and caring for as well. Through that, I also have PTSD. I also dealt with my own trauma, saving his life, from that attempt. But then even there were a couple additional specific moments that, as I have looked back on them, I've begun to realize and notice my triggers, my triggers for those events, and realizing, oh, those were traumatic for me.
Yeah. Yeah.
Those weren't just stressful. Those are, trauma. So I have gone through EMDR as well, for my own trauma healing. So,
I
so
had
that's
to
kind of a bit of our story.
I love that you're being so transparent about telling your story, because there are so many of us out there who have had to deal with this. And that my husband had anxiety, depression, which led to suicidal ideation. And I had
Mm,
no idea until one night he was talking to a counselor on the phone. And then we had to go through the whole hospitalization. And then when he came home,
mm,
all of the how do we find medication? How do we balance this?
yes.
And it is there are even now there are things that I'll see in him. There's things that will trigger, and it is a trauma to the person who is caring and living
Mm-hmm.
and loving that person. And I just
Yes.
completed some trauma therapy myself in the last
Oh,
few months,
good.
because I didn't realize that it was having that kind of an effect on me. You're trying to be
Mm-hmm.
strong. And so I learned very quickly that I needed to get in and get some help. And so I did. And I think just a little segue here, if you're listening to this story and you identify in any way with the stress or the anxiety that comes with loving and caring for somebody, it's so important for you as a caregiver to get treatment and help. And
Yes.
I will always say, please, please, please reach out. And you can reach out to Amber, you can reach out to me.
Mm-hmm.
We will try to help point you in the right direction.
Yeah.
So Amber, as we kind
So
of go ahead, you want to say something
one
else?
quick thing with that, yes. So I wrote a guide um,
Okay.
that you can actually get to it on my choosejoyinthemidst.com website, and I think on my author website. But anyhow, it's a resource that
Okay.
you sign up for. It's like how to find a mental health therapist. I'm redoing it as a
Okay.
gift with my book, so I'm going to be revising, updating it, editing it, but you can still have access to it. They are the steps I took when we were desperate and
So
in the
good.
midst of crisis. And then I have done these same steps, and I have
Okay.
like two websites that I use to find a therapist. So yeah,
Okay.
it's so important.
I'll put,
But yeah,
we'll put the links to all of that in the show notes
yeah,
so that you can just click
absolutely.
and go right there. And then there
That'd
will
be great.
also be emails. If you struggle to find it, reach out
Mm-hmm.
to me, reach out to Amber. We will make sure. And it's always
Yes.
important for me to to help the listener understand. Because when you're sitting there and you think you're alone and you're overwhelmed and you're dealing with such a chaotic situation, it is so helpful to know that somebody else has walked through this and that we are
Yes.
here to encourage and inspire and love and help in any way. And Amber has a lot. I've looked at some of her stuff, and her stuff is very incredible. I cannot wait for her book to come out.
Mm,
So, as I
thank you.
said, we will have her back to talk about her book
Yeah.
as well in the fall. So, let's talk for a few minutes about the difference between combat trauma and civilian trauma, because
Mm-hmm.
you identify these as two separate things. And so, share with us about this thought.
Sure. So, there's actually a book that helped me understand. It was very pivotal at the beginning of my caregiving story. And it's called it's by Charles Hogue, Hoge. Once a Warrior, Always a Warrior, I think is the name of it. And anyway, he talks on how a civilian, you're not planning to see trauma, you're not planning to face trauma. And for a civilian, it's usually trauma is typically a single event that has
Mm-hmm.
occurred where you felt helpless and powerless. And now, granted, there can be complex trauma, there can be
Mm-hmm.
multiple traumas.
Mm-hmm.
I myself have multiple traumas, but a few single events that have all occurred. There can also be, like if you've heard of adverse childhood events, ACEs, that's kind of a slightly different aspect because it's a lot, and continual. But anyhow, civilian for the most part is going to be a single event
Mm-hmm.
that was traumatic. So then you look at combat trauma. And so for these military, they have been trained, they are tactically ready. They know they're going to face dangerous and stressful situations that could be life threatening, that
Mm.
probably will be life threatening. And they are entering into that, for our freedom, to because they are doing their duty because they have signed up to serve.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so these combat veterans, when they have trauma occur, um, it can typically be um, a very overwhelming, life-threatening event.
Mm.
They could have been facing many, 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 and then for whatever reason, one event was traumatic for them. They don't get to choose whether
Mm.
that becomes trauma or not. And I know we're going to talk about this in a minute, but it is something that subconsciously occurs within our brain. Um, when trauma is categorized. We
Mm.
don't get to will ourselves to not have trauma. It's just something that happens within us.
Yeah.
And I actually wanted to read, let's find it. Okay, so I just wanted to read one or two of his quotes from the book,
Mm-hmm.
from the Once a Warrior, Always a Warrior. So he says, unit members who are likely to be most at risk to develop serious PTSD symptoms are those with the closest personal connection or friendship to the injured individual. Okay, those who felt directly responsible in some way for the health and welfare of the injured individual, or those who felt most helpless to intervene in preventing the
Mm.
tragedy. So for someone who is in combat, the trauma may in fact be that they want to act in a certain way to prevent, something from happening. They
Mm-hmm.
want to be able to act and they cannot.
Right.
There's something, the way in which they want to be able to do something, there's something preventing them. Like my husband, he didn't want his buddy to die.
Mm.
He couldn't prevent that from occurring when
Right.
it did, you know?
Right.
And so that can really be, very
We have a
impactful. Yeah.
we have a very close family member who went through a situation where their entire platoon was under attack, and a lot of them passed away. Were killed in
Mm,
action, and I know that to this day there's still that PTSD, and there's just things that trigger it. And you
yeah.
write that you just said it, and you also write this: you cannot control whether trauma occurs or not.
Yeah.
And that doesn't matter. That, I think, that's between civilian trauma and combat trauma. We can't
Yes, it
control
is.
both.
Yeah.
Like, even you and I with the PTSD of dealing with someone who's been struggling with suicidal ideation, we can't control whether that trauma occurs or not. And you also write, it is subconsciously categorized by a part of our limbic system in the brain.
Mhm.
Now,
Yep, the
I'm
limbic
really a
system.
nerd about wanting to
Mhm.
understand these things. So break down for us what you're saying and what you're meaning when you say we can't
Yeah.
control whether it occurs or not because it's categorized by whatever this part of our brain is.
Okay. So, yeah, I did not understand all this until I began to really research and read and want to understand. Um, all the neuroscience that's occurring. And I still have, more to learn because there are people, neuroscientists, much smarter than me because I'm not a neuroscientist. But so if you've ever heard the term neurons that fire together, wire together,
I have heard that.
that was a neuroscientist that said that what fires together is wired together. And so when you have sensory input, okay, so your five senses, what you see, smell, taste, hear, or touch.
Mhm.
Okay, so you have something that you are noticing that's coming in, and then at the same time, an event is happening. Okay, so, an object that you see and a very stressful or then, let's say, traumatic event that occurs at the same exact time. So both of those things are being processed at the same time. And somewhat processed by your brain. They are coming in at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
And so they actually wire together, they
Oh,
connect together somewhat. And so when that sensory input, when that information comes into the brain, it comes in through something called the thalamus.
okay.
And then the thalamus is going to then send it on to two different parts of your memory system. So your cognitive side of things, I'm going to stay not very technical here. It goes a lot more technical, but to your cognitive side, your like cerebral cortex. There's
Mm-hmm.
also um, yeah, some other aspects there, like the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. Really important things. But anyhow, so it goes there, but it doesn't go there as fast as it goes to
Okay.
your emotional brain. And the emotional brain is your limbic system, and then I believe your brainstem. Okay, so
Okay.
when it comes in, the thalamus sends it to two places,
Yeah.
and the one it goes to fastest is that limbic system.
Which is the
Okay.
emotional
The
response.
emotional, yep, the emotional processing that's going to occur. And so then if you've heard of the amygdala,
Mm-hmm.
you probably have. That's your fight or flight. A lot of people
Mm-hmm.
remember amygdala, fight or flight. So the amygdala actually helps to categorize and process that input and attach emotional information to it.
Okay.
So when that information comes in and it goes in the limbic system in the amygdala, and there's other parts that also work with it. But when it comes to the amygdala and it is processed, then that is when that event could potentially be categorized as trauma,
Okay. That's
if
very
that makes
clear.
sense.
I hope,
Yeah.
yeah, it was very clear to me.
Hopefully that
I
makes
hope,
sense.
yeah, no,
Yeah.
I think when the trauma comes in, what's happening is our brain is created to process things. And when trauma
Mm-hmm.
happens, then it goes to those different parts of our brain. And you talked about it going to the emotional side of the brain first.
Mm-hmm.
Is this where does negative, like when we have trauma, there's things that happen. So when my husband started to have trauma, he had some real negative behavior, some real negative things started happening. And when I had trauma, I'm still having those negative behaviors, but I'm not choosing to go, and I'm choosing something more positive. So there's some negative
Mm-hmm.
things that pop up. So talk to us for a
Mm-hmm.
second about that.
Okay. So going back to that firing and wiring together, so those sensory stimuli that are connected to whatever the event was, let's say it was traumatic. So let's say you see an object that reminds you of the object
Okay.
that was there during that traumatic event, or you, like for my husband, you smell the smell
Oh,
after
okay.
the explosion, and you're at where it occurred, before your buddy's being before
It
the
takes you
helicopter
right
comes and
back. The
whatnot.
smell just
Yeah,
takes you right
that
back.
smell takes you right back. That sensory
Mm-hmm.
is connected to that event. So when that happens, whatever the trigger is, that sensory stimuli, when that happens, then it's as if you're back in that event, back in
Mm-hmm.
that trauma. And so then that is how that trauma response can occur. So,
Mm-hmm.
for me, when I start, my adrenaline starts going and I'm feeling revved up, and, I'm like, am I in danger? Is there a danger here?
Mm-hmm.
And you're cognitively trying to tell yourself, but I'm not in danger, but your body is saying
Yeah.
you are. And so anyhow, that's kind of how that firing, wiring, and then triggering happens. So, um, so like for my husband and many, many others, or it sounds like for your husband maybe as well, we have that trauma response. We don't want to feel that revved up
Mm-hmm.
and all of that. And so then we can turn to something to try to cope, to try to soothe, to try to distract or numb that feeling. We
Yes.
don't want to feel it. We don't know what to do with it. We don't have control over it because it's a subconscious response.
Mm.
And so And so we turn to something called negative coping strategies. And we all can to
Yeah.
some varying degree. And so a negative coping strategy is something that we use, like I said, to numb, distract, soothe, something that we don't want to face, we don't want to feel. And it can be anything. It can be food and binge eating, sex, pornography. It can be exercise, drugs, alcohol. It can even be perfectionism. It can be work. It can be shopping, being too busy. We can try to drown out the things that we don't want to face. And so even as something begins to be in excess, a negative coping strategy, then that's where we can head into dependence and even addiction. So
That's
yeah.
so good. Oh, thank you for that. I know
Yeah.
that in your research, well, I want to just back up because as you were talking, I realized, I was raised by an abusive alcoholic father. And there was this tone in his yelling and in his voice that I would always hear right before there was going to be a strike, and it would be at me. And so even now, if I am in a situation where if I hear that same tone, there is that moment where you just described, where you stop and you go, okay, wait, he's not here. It's not happening. It's not true. But for that moment, you have to, it's almost like I am forced to go back and deal with it over again. And I can see where that would get very, just exhausting for like someone with like my husband who, and I can see all of the different ways that he copes and realize that some of them are negative, some of them are not. But if you're not dealing with the trauma or not identifying it, then I can see where you might get stuck and go deeper into something that's very, very negative and trying to, like you said, focus anywhere but the trauma and because of the pain. And I think
Thank you for sharing that, Carol.
Oh, thank you.
About your childhood.
As I walk, as I go through, I have become so, over the last couple of years, so sensitive to the homeless people in the city where I live, because a lot of them are veterans and a lot of them have untreated trauma, untreated mental illness. And so, it is not uncommon for me to find one when I'm at a restaurant and pull them in and say, hey, can I buy you some food? And then they're looking at me like, well, I'll just stay out here. I'm like, no, come on in, order what you want, pick what you want. No, just pick for me. No, you pick. I want to get you what you want to eat. And then watching the response of the people around, like, what is he doing in here? And I'm like, he's buying food. Leave him alone. But I think that when we start looking at,
you're giving them dignity in that moment,
trying so hard to do that, and not trying to change their trauma, but just trying to find some way to encourage and I love that, giving them a dignity
alongside them.
And I think when we talk, one of the things that I was noticing in the notes about your book was the statistics for veteran suicides. And I know they're high, but will you share some of your research with us?
Yeah. So in terms of the statistics, they come from, it's an annual report that you can also access online. You can access the entire thing and read further. There are so many numbers, and they do a great job. But it's from the 2023 National Veteran Suicide Prevention Annual Report.
Okay.
And so it's the 2023 annual report, but it is the data from 2021.
Okay.
Okay. Now, if you've ever heard of the number 22 connected to veterans, it was 22 a day, and we wanted to decrease it in terms of how many deaths of suicide of veterans. Well, it has been decreased, at least by this data. So in 2021, the veteran suicide deaths per day were 17 and a half.
Okay.
average-wise, which is still a
High.
significant number to think, like today,
Mm-hmm.
17 veterans would be dying.
Mm.
Actually more, because it's 17 and a half, that on average 18 basically veterans dying today. And how can we come alongside? How can we support? How can we see them and be there for them? Now, granted, these statistics are U.S. data, so only in the U.S. is what they're looking at. So 17 and a half deaths per day of veteran suicide. Total is 6,392 veterans. So 6,392 in 2021 from suicide. And if we look at non-veteran U.S. adults who died by suicide, it is a larger number, obviously, because it's a larger population. And suicide deaths and people dying by suicide is a national epidemic that we are facing
Yes.
as a
Yes.
country right now. And we all can increase, and we can talk about it later, but we can increase awareness and increase knowledge around mental health first aid,
Yeah.
to be able to recognize risk factors, recognize warning signs, so that we are more equipped to help those around us, whether they're civilians, veterans, whoever. So anyhow, 6,392 veterans died, 40,020 non-veteran U.S. adults died by suicide. Now, this is out of 18, almost 19 million veterans versus 239.5 million non-veterans. I know those numbers are kind of difficult to pull in. So they adjusted it per population size and whatnot. And I don't want to decrease the impact of the non-veteran deaths, because it is horrific.
It's a horrific epidemic that we have to figure out.
But the unadjusted suicide rate, and this is where I want to get to, because obviously we're talking about veterans specifically today. In 2021, the unadjusted suicide rate for veterans was 33.9 per 100,000, whereas non-veteran U.S. adults is 16.7 per 100,000. So basically, when you adjust it's unadjusted, but when you decrease it down to population size, it's almost twice as many veterans of the veteran population are dying by suicide than non-veteran civilians. So that is why this conversation surrounding veteran suicide is so incredibly important.
Just wow. I mean, I knew that when you took the percentages, and I love that you broke that down, because we are not saying that the general population suicidal rate is not important, but today,
it's
for
all
our
important.
it's all important. And for our
one
conversation,
person dying is too many of anyone.
Yes. And I just think that there has, when we look at the percentage of veterans, 33%. Oh my gosh, that's so hard.
33.9 of
33.9%. So what are some of the barriers for active military and veterans in seeking help for mental health issues, and when they start feeling these ways?
Well, I think first of all, and again, I am the spouse, so I'm not the military member themselves. I mean, I do talk with my husband. I did have him have his insight and his perspective after I wrote my veteran chapters in my book. And that was very helpful. But some of the barriers are going to be, not being seen as weak. Or why would I have trauma? I went to battle, why would I be weak? I shouldn't have that. And again, like we talked about before, it has nothing to do with our desire, our thoughts, our our will. It is something subconsciously done inside of our brain. So anyhow, but yeah, so some other barriers being having concern that they will lose their position or their job. Um, yeah, that is a concern. Being deemed non-combat ready, so not
Yeah.
being able to deploy and do the job that they were trained to do and serve and support their brothers in arms.
Mm.
Not being able to go on the next trip downrange, that is hard. Failing their unit or their team if they can't do their job. Um, Another one would be not, there's avoidance with PTSD, certainly avoiding those triggers. So not wanting to talk about that combat trauma,
Mhm. Yeah.
that can definitely be a barrier in seeking therapy. I will say that there are some therapies that you don't have to talk as much to have help. The one we did, EMDR,
Mhm.
is one. There are some others as well that can help in that. But yeah, so barriers, I know there's going to be a lot more that others would say
Mhm.
as well. But for someone in the military, their job, their duty, their identity, and then also the connection they have with their units is incredibly important and part of life. And so how are people going to perceive me? Will I still be a part of my unit? Those are, I don't have answers for those, but those are barriers. Those are um, things we need to talk about
Mhm.
to try to help,
Yeah.
to
Do you
bring them down.
Yeah. Do you think that
Yeah.
there could be a trigger also when they get out of the military and they're walking away
Mhm.
from this unit that has been such an integral part of
Yes.
their experience? And now some of these veterans, I can imagine some of these veterans who are out there on the streets, maybe their families don't know how to deal with them, and maybe it's just they're lost without that unit of
Yes.
people who support them. So what
There
are
there
Go
are
ahead.
there are statistics, and in that annual report, I believe it's in that one, there are statistics that address that specifically, and I remember, some of the statistics, I think with Marines, it was even higher in
Wow.
terms of a certain length of time following being discharged or retired, and, um, I think potential increased suicidality. So yeah, having, being connected into with other veterans,
Mhm.
having community, those are helpful.
Mhm.
Yeah, helpful in terms of coming alongside. But yeah, it's hard.
Wow. Wow. What are some of the VA/DoD guidelines that are used to treat PTSD?
hmm So the current guidelines for treatment of PTSD and acute stress disorder, so post-traumatic stress
Mhm.
disorder and then acute stress disorder from the VA DoD, that they recommend with strong evidence three right now.
Okay.
So CPT, which is cognitive processing
Mhm.
therapy,
I'm familiar with that.
EMDR, which is that eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, and then prolonged exposure, which is PE, prolonged exposure therapy.
Okay.
Of those three, the CPT, the cognitive processing therapy, and the PE, prolonged exposure, those are both a cognitive or a CBT based
Mhm.
therapy, whereas then EMDR is obviously a different
Yeah.
modality.
Yeah.
Um,
So then how can we bring this down to me and some of the other listeners out there? What are some ways that
mhm.
we can come alongside our military and veterans to encourage them and to, as you said a few minutes ago, give them dignity, give them dignity?
Well, some ways we can come alongside them. are going to be having awareness. Now, I will say, going on to a couple different websites and reading about like warning signs of suicide or increased warning signs of suicide risk. So some of those websites are going to be afsp.org. That's the American Foundation dealing with suicide. So AFSP, there is, I think NIH is another one, and then NAMI,
Yes.
NAMI.
NAMI. Yes.
Yep, NAMI. So those, I drew from, especially I think from NAMI and then AFSP, as I was writing about the warning signs and symptoms of suicide. So becoming aware of what to look for, because there's a lot of different things to look for and be aware of, and then knowing about 988. So 988 is that suicide and crisis lifeline, and you can call, you can text it. If you are concerned, about increased suicide risk or crisis, or you're not sure, but you need guidance, you can call, they will help. And there's even a specific line on it for veterans as
Oh, good.
well. So knowing that, because if you're concerned, you're like, oh my goodness, what do I do? It seems like this person's struggling, then you can reach out for help right
Yeah.
away,
Yeah.
or going to the closest emergency room if there is increased suicide risk, or if someone has a plan, or so
Okay.
that another thing is going to be lethal means safety. And if you've not heard of that, that is something that the VA talks about and promotes. And basically, what it is taking action, very focused, intentional action to remove or limit access to lethal means.
Yeah, that
So
makes
obviously
sense.
guns, knives, medication. It can even be additional things that could be in danger. So ropes or whatnot. There could be a different means that is of danger to a loved one. So basically, when you can increase time and space from that loved one who may be in a moment of crisis, if you can increase their time and space from lethal means, then it can help
Yeah, that makes
protect
sense.
against suicide. So that's some of them. Another one is, and you'll be like, how is this? But authenticity. I believe strongly in being authentic, and as I'm sure you could tell, but being authentic and being real about our struggles, what we ourselves are dealing with. So not putting on a facade or a front to others, in our regular life, being able to be willing to mention, oh, hey, I struggle with this, or, like appropriately, but in being able to be authentic and real about the things that we are facing, then we can welcome in other people to being open about their own struggles. And it kind of invites them, if they were not planning to share, about, oh, I've been thinking about harming myself.
I think,
Maybe they would feel more
yeah,
comfortable
I
by
think,
you
yeah,
opening up. Yeah.
I think we just need conversations. I think
Conversation. Yeah,
we need to
absolutely.
just, when my husband first began to struggle with his mental health issues 10 years ago, I couldn't find anyone who wanted to have a conversation with me. In fact, I would find
Mm,
more people who would say, I'm really sorry I asked what's going on because I really don't want to.
yeah.
And along the way,
Yeah.
I'm seeing there's more conversations happening, but that is where my desire to have the podcast, to have these conversations with you, Amber, to really start to talk about, let's have conversations, because, so many times I see my daughter-in-law is very, very good. She has 4 little kids, and she's very good about teaching her kids about the value of our military. And I can see, we were just somewhere where somebody came in that was a soldier, and my 10-year-old grandson walked up to him and reached out his hand and said, "Thank you so much for your service." And I think sometimes, like when I was talking about, I don't know if if the homeless person I'm helping is a veteran, but I know that the statistics tell me that it's a high percentage of a chance that they are.
Very likely.
And then we have, in my church, we have a man who has a ministry to veterans, and supporting that ministry. I think there's so many things that we can do if we're willing to get out of our comfort zone, have the conversations, and just say, how can I help? And I think, that's so,
checking in.
Checking in. Oh my gosh.
Checking in with someone. Yeah.
And if you know, and if you know a caretaker who is caring for someone that is a veteran who struggles with some pretty serious PTSD, checking in on them. It's important for us to check in on the caretaker and just make sure they're taking care of themselves. And so, Amber, I just want to say thank you. Thank you for this conversation. And I cannot wait till your book comes out and we can have further conversation and kind of go out into the civilian world a little bit with what we're dealing with. But as we close out this meaningful conversation today, and it has been very meaningful to me, thank you. Is there one last thought? Well. Yeah, thank you. Is there one last thought you'd like to leave with us?
Well, can I leave 2?
Sure. Go for it. Leave 2, of course.
The reason why
I'm not going to say no.
Because I wanted to mention in terms of EMDR.
Yes.
EMDR is a game changer because, like I said, one of the barriers, especially for veterans, but others, is not wanting to talk about, your events. But EMDR, the way it works with the, if you're familiar, the bilateral dual stimulation, while you are briefly focusing on the memory, and the event, then it can access your limbic system, and then it can help, and it's much more complicated, but it can help to begin to rewire and allow the brain to begin to heal itself. So that's what I witnessed for my husband in terms of his PTSD symptoms decreasing significantly after only like 3 or 4 EMDR sessions after we had been going for how long with therapy. And then also for myself, it helped significantly. So thank you for letting me share my that one. But then the last thought I would love to leave, and this goes honestly for the ones struggling with mental health and suicide, but definitely for the caregiver. You are not alone. You are seen. I am here. I experientially understand. Understand the walking through the battle and fighting for your loved one's life. And I just want you to know that, you're not alone.
I love that.
We are
I love that.
here. So,
And that is why, Amber, I started this caretaking ministry. That's why I started the podcast. That's why I started the newsletter. Beautiful. This is my goal. And I know this is why you wrote your book. I know that there's so many incredible people out there who are saying, no, it's time for us to know we're not alone. That we are here as a community to encourage each other. And so thank you for joining me. Thank you for helping me talk about some hard things, but in a way that we can walk away with hope. There's this hope now that there is that there is help. And I will put all of this in the show notes, and I may reach out to you to get a few more
Yeah.
websites and
That'd
maybe
be great.
recommendations of where a person would go to look for EMDR treatments, how they would find out or what they would ask their doctor for. But thank you so much for joining me, Amber. And I look forward to having you come back when your book comes out later this fall. And
Thanks for having me. Yeah.
thank you. And I just want to say thank you to each of you who are listening. I am so excited that we could spend July 4th honoring our veterans and our active military and their caregivers, because I am so thankful. I have very close family members who are currently active veterans. I have family members who are active military, and I have family members who are veterans. And I am so thankful for the sacrifice. And it is a big sacrifice that they have given to protect our freedom. And so I'm thankful for you for tuning in today. If you know a caretaker, please share this show with them. Also, follow or subscribe to the podcast, because that helps other caretakers find us. It gets us higher in the algorithms. The people who put the podcast, organically in front of other people take notice of how many people follow the show. And so I would just ask you to do that to help us. And then also make sure you go to my website, go to Amber's website, sign up for our newsletters, get our downloads. My newsletter just launched again June 1st after it had been dormant for a little over a year because my caretaking just got too much for me, but it just launched June 1st. And I am so excited because it's full of inspiration and tips and giveaways and book recommendations and information about some fun stuff coming in 2025 and 2026. And the email community is always going to find out that information first. And I hope that you will join me next week for another meaningful conversation. And I hope that you have a beautiful July 4th weekend. And I am so excited to come back next week with another meaningful conversation about what it looks like to be on the Caretaker's Journey. And until then, it's all about him.